All right, everybody, if you want to take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. Today's lecture is on the 10 myths of creativity. So here's a list of the myths that we're going to talk about today, and I'll go through one each individually. There's no particular order, but I think they all represent ideas and concepts that perhaps you thought related to creativity, or you thought something about creativity, and in fact, they're just a little bit different than you might have understood them. So let's start with the concept of incubation and creativity. So Wallace, back in 1926, proposed this idea of creative problem solving in a four-step process, and he used Poincaré, Mozart, and Coleridge as an example of people who had reported the solving problems during an incubation period. And the model he proposed was one of preparing, incubating, finding the solution, and verifying. And basically, what all three people had reported was they'd started to work on a problem, and then they left it. But when they came back to work on it, or while they were away, suddenly they had found a solution. And so that question of incubation time, of being away from the problem, what impact does that have on your ability to creatively solve problems or to create a new creative piece of art, for instance? So what's happening during this incubation period? And I want to run you through a little an example here that's kind of fun to go through. All right? So we're going to do a little test. Okay, so this is the demo. This is going to explain how we do the test. Okay, there's three words here: fox, man, and peep. What one word logically ties all those together? Whole, right? Okay, great. So we're going to do the same thing with some other words, but you're going to have to write down the answer. So get out a sheet of paper so you can write down what word goes with these three. Okay? Ready? Here we go. Dust, cereal, fish. What word goes with those three? Lift, card, and mask. What word goes with those three? How about horse, human, and drag? What word goes with those three? All right, final one. Child, scan, and wash. All right, if you haven't got any answers, that's okay. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. Now we're going to go on and we're going to do a different exercise, all right? You're going to see a string of letters, and your goal is to either say it's a word or it's not a word. So you're either going to say word or no. Okay, ready? Forest. Ready? Okay, great. So now let's go and look at some of the problems that we were looking at previously. Horse, human, and drag. Did you get any ideas on what the answer for that might be? Dust, cereal, fish. Did you get any ideas for that one? Child, scan, wash. Lift, card, and mask. Oil, bar, and tuna. All right, let's go back and look at those answers and also look at what was different in that second set of problems, all right? So let's go back to the beginning here. Horse, human, drag. What's the connection? Race, right? Horse race, human race, drag race. Great. Dust, cereal, fish. What's the common word? Bowl, right? Child, scan, wash. Did you get this one? This one's kind of tired. Brain. Brainchild, brain scan, brainwash. Okay, lift, card, mask. This one's sometimes a little tough. Face. Okay? Oil, bar, and tuna. What's the connecting word? Salad. That's right. Now, if you noticed, some of these, like oil, bar, and tuna, weren't in our old set, was it? Child, scan, wash. Did you notice anything when we said word or no word that might relate to this? Let's go back and look at that list of words. Salad, remember? Tuna, oil, salad. Brain, remember brainwash? All right? So you can see that some of these words actually were contained in the problems and some were not. And so why did we go through this? Because we basically started a set of problems, and then we went off and did something else, and then we came back to the same set of problems. And this was an experiment that was done just about 5 or 8 years ago. And let me show you the results of what came about. What people had found was that had you not seen the problem before, so this is like tuna and salad oil and tuna for salad, that wasn't in the first set. If you hadn't seen it, having seen the word salad didn't seem to help you. But if you had seen the problem before, then actually seeing a hint in that second process actually helped you. More people could solve the problem when they saw a hint after they were exposed to the problem. And the results of this one experiment were trying to show the fact that this idea of problem and then incubation can be thought of as sort of prepping or priming the mind and then allowing external stimulus to seed answers. And that because we're already primed with some question or some idea that we're looking for, that the experiences we gain after or during the incubation is actually what leads us to being able to solve the problem. So this was kind of a simple problem to kind of show how changing tasks may actually give you a little bit of unconscious help in your problems. And we're going to return to this in just a second. So they talk about these problems, these open problems, as open goals. So this is the idea that you start a problem and you can't finish it, and so you take a break. And so the idea that the researchers put forth was that there's a mechanism that pays attention to what's relevant in your environment. And you can seed what's relevant by starting on a problem. This is sometimes called the privileged status of incomplete tasks. We'll talk a little bit later about cognitive effect that's been named after this. This is done without conscious awareness. You probably didn't notice when you saw salad that that was going to relate to something, or that brain was going to relate to one of the previous test examples. And they've done studies like this in a variety of different disciplines, and they've always found similar results. That priming yourself for a problem really allows your unconscious mind to see things, to see solutions. I think it was Pasteur that said, chance favors a prepared mind. Well, the psychology behind that is that if your mind is prepared with a question, it's more likely to notice something when you're not working on the problem. And so some of the things put forward is that exposure to problem-solving skills, problem solving during a break, improves your likelihood to solve it. One of the conclusions of this study was that seeing the information ahead of the problem didn't really help. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next exercise that we're going to do. And this is sometimes an explanation for incidental assimilation. Basically, it seems like we somehow got to a place and didn't know how we got there. So, how can we account for the success that Mozart and Poincaré and others had during these incubation periods. And so some examples that are given up here and that have been used in several different studies is, the first is fatigue reduction. You get tired, you can't think straight, taking a break from the problem actually just lets you rest. Fixation reduction. We'll talk about fixation in just a little bit, but sometimes we get focused on a single point and it's not the right answer, and it's very difficult for us to break away. So taking literally a break allows us to start and look at the problem fresh because we no longer fixated. I'll skip statistical regression. Unconscious work we're going to talk about in a second, and also conscious work. If you look at people when they've been reporting about these incubation periods, rarely have they really stopped work. It might mean they're not at their desk writing out the problem anymore, but they're still walking around and thinking about it. And I mentioned this before, this is the Zeigarnik effect. And this has to do with the fact that incomplete tasks are often remembered best. The way to think about it is, if you start solving a problem that you're interested in solving and you stop, your body sort of feels like there's an incomplete. I'll just give you an example. If I said 1 + 1 is 2 pops in your head, right? You'd feel very uncomfortable just to stop with 1 + 1. Now that's a toy problem. But there's lots of examples of where people have started on a problem and it just sticks with you. And that's actually something that you can leverage to realize that if you start working and then take a break, that problem's going with you. But also, it helps you realize that if you're trying to break a fixation, that you need to realize that those problems are sticking with you. And maybe if it's the wrong problem or problem definition, what you need to do is take a longer break or actually engage in something totally different that might break you away. All right, this segues us into the unconscious mind. And there's a famous experiment I want to share with you that's actually been told many times. It's about 80, 90 years old. It was by Norman Maier, I think at the University of Michigan. And the title of the paper was Reasoning in Humans, the Solution of a Problem and Its Appearance in the Consciousness. This is known colloquially as the two-rope problem. All right, so here's the setup. So basically what happened is they took a bunch of participants into a room and they hung 2 ropes from the ceilings. Now the catch was the 2 ropes were far enough apart that you could not grab both ends and tie them together. So the ropes were far enough away that you couldn't do that. And the goal was to figure out some way to connect the 2 ropes, to tie them together. Now in the room what they'd done is they'd put several props. They'd put an extension cord, they'd put a chair, and I think there's a few other things around the room. And they let participants go in there and try to figure out different ways to connect the ropes. And initially what would happen is people would go in, and there's a few simple solutions. One is you can simply take the chair, tie the rope to it, move the chair over, and then you can go grab the other rope and bring it to the chair. Another simple example is you can take the extension cord, tie it to one end of the rope, and then just drag it over and tie it to the other one. Most people found those pretty quickly. But after that, Maier asked the question, is there another solution that's out there that you haven't thought of? And he let him go and work. And he let him work for 5 to 10 minutes to try to figure out what that was. And then he started giving some hints. And so the first hint was he just walked by a rope and brushed it with his arm to make the rope swing gently. Then he just walked back and continued observing the experiment. If the person didn't solve the problem with that hint, then what he would do is he'd hand the subject, this would be 5 or 6 minutes later, hand the subject a pair of pliers and let them know that that's all they need to find this solution. So those are the 2 hints. Do you have any idea how you solve the problem? Maybe you've seen this before. The idea is if you can get one of the ropes to swing in a pendulum, you can actually get it moving back and forth. You can go to the other rope, grab it, and walk over, and on the upswing, you get the 2, and you can tie them together. The idea of the plier is to sort of create this idea of a pendulum. Maybe people can figure out that you can actually tie it on the bottom to get the rope to move. And so he went and did 61 students at the University of Chicago, and let's just take a look at what the results show, because they're very interesting. So 24 found the solution with no hints. 23 found it with hint 1. 14 failed to solve the problem. And what Maier looked at was he wanted to find out about these 23 where the hint had some impact. And there's a data here on the left of all of the 23 in this group of individuals who needed a hint. And I just want you to notice something that in the table is the last solution. So this was when they figured out to use the chair or the extension cord, and the time that the hint came. And the average time was about 5 or 6 minutes between those two. So we wanted to give them a chance to think on their own. And then I just want to point out before we look at some of the data directly that the solutions after hint 1 came on average 42 seconds after the hint. So that means they thought about the problem for at least 6 minutes, and then he brushed the rope, and the majority of them, we'll look at the exact data in a second, found it in just 42 seconds. And this strong proximity in time, I think all of us can agree, leads to a connection, right? That something about this hint had to affect. So the 16 subjects, so there were 16 subjects that said, it just clicked. I just got it. It just happened right in my mind. It was as if it appeared out of nowhere. And that's kind of interesting because we hear about these people of, I just had it. It just came to me. I don't know where it came from. So 16 of the 23 in this group where the hints said it happened all at once. And of the 16, this is really interesting, 15 said that the hint of moving the rope with the shoulder had no effect. Interestingly, 4 out of 15 said emphatically it had absolutely no part. And the other 11 said it could have had, but they really didn't notice it. That there was no conscious awareness that they saw that and then came to the solution. And so once again, it's really interesting. They all said they did not recognize or remember the brushing of the rope having any effect. Yet, after 6 minutes of solving the problem, no solution, 42 seconds on average after brushing that rope, people solved it. Now, the other group out of this 23 were 7 subjects, and they said it didn't come to them right at once. It came gradually to them. And all 7, all but 1, actually said that the brushing of the rope was a stimulus. So one thing we can draw from this, that as you're looking and seeing that problems or solutions come just out of the blue, it appears that what's happening is your mind is solving it from unconscious hints, and you're just not aware of it. And that some people do piece things together slower, and those hints are seen, but not always. Now, what was interesting is he went and did a second experiment where he actually took the pliers and he would twirl them at the end of a rope. So this is pretty explicit, right? You think about how do you use pliers, you use them to grab onto something, but if I tie them to the end of the rope and swing them, you immediately think of maybe a pendulum or using the pliers as a weight rather than as a tool. And so what he did is he actually twirled the pliers on a rope, then he let them go back to the problem, and then he passed by that same rope again and brushed it with his shoulder. What he found was, shortly after the brushing of the rope, almost everybody solved the problem. Now, there was a good 4 or 5 minutes between the twirling of the pliers and the brushing of the rope. In that 4 or 5 minutes, no solution, but as soon as they brushed up again, within about a minute, they'd solved it. So once again, it looks like that brushing of the rope seemed correlated strongly to the solution. But when they asked them, did the brushing of the rope have any effect, their answer was no, but the pliers did. Because when they did the pliers, they showed it to them as a deliberate act. And as a deliberate act, it went in their conscious. But the unconscious hint, they never saw. So I think this is a fascinating experiment. This is why it's been taught for the past 80 or 90 years in how we perceive. In the fact that these solutions just coming out of the blue are often just from our unconscious mind noticing something and piecing together the solution. So I think I shared here with you the conclusions on this experiment. So now I want to talk a little bit about knowledge versus ignorance. Because in education, we teach you that knowledge is what's important, right? And oftentimes in creativity, it's often said that sometimes being ignorant is a benefit. So let's just look at some examples, okay? So why would knowledge be bad? Can you guys think of anything? So I want to give you two examples where knowledge is no help, means it's not a hindrance, but it's no help, or it is actually a hindrance, okay? The first one is what's called an insight problem, and I'll describe that in a second. And the second one relates to blockers. Okay, so here's an insight problem. So the insight problem is something that we can solve without really actually having to know a technique to solve it. And so students were given the following sort of example to start with. They're taught a solution to find the area of this rectangle, okay? And the way they're taught is they're given a square that they're told is 1 centimeter, and they're taught to, an easy way to find the area is just to take the square and place it inside the rectangle and just count them up. So the answer is 12 square centimeters. Okay, so they're taught this is a solution for finding the problem. Okay, if you will, this is knowledge. They're then given this shape and asked to find the area. Now, I should preface this that the students who were given this were, I believe, in either 3rd or 5th grade, so they're elementary school students. And so when you're given this shape, the knowledge you have before is not particularly useful, right? They taught you how to do a rectangle, but not a parallelogram. So how do you solve this problem? To solve this, you need to figure out a new way to determine the area, or a new way to reshape the problem. Having that prior knowledge of how to solve it doesn't help you here. You actually have to create a new solution in your mind. Can you think of anything that might be easy? So a little girl who had just been playing crafts, cutting things up with scissors, noted that she could just cut off one of the triangles and move it over here, and then you could just fit the squares in just like that. So you see, sometimes having knowledge doesn't really help you because the problem itself doesn't require that knowledge. And it may seem sort of simple to you, but I think many of us think that the solution to the problem has to come from some knowledge we have. And sometimes just abandoning that knowledge or not having any knowledge actually benefits you because the problem you need to solve doesn't reuse that same knowledge. So the change of the problem didn't involve any previous knowledge, but rather ability to generate new ideas. And so I point out here that children's creativity often reduces as they get older. Part of it is because we teach them how to solve problems, and the implicit message we're giving them is problems should be solved with a method. And they really don't develop a skill set of inventing new solutions or new methods. All right, we're going to talk next about some ideas of blockers. All right, so pre-bias and blockers. I want to talk a little bit about how we can be pre-biased and also how things can block us. And this will tie a little bit back into those word games we played initially at the beginning of lecture. All right, so the idea here is you have some stimulus that you're trying to maybe create something new or you're trying to solve a problem, and you have some dominant response. And the non-dominant response, so typically what would not be the first thing that comes to your mind, is actually what you're looking for. And so the blockers are things that direct you in the upward direction, so towards something that is a dominant response but isn't the answer, and away from what is the correct answer. And we're going to do another little exercise here next. All right, so here's a crossword puzzle that I created. And we'll just take a look at it. I'll just show you a couple examples. 1 down, a series of 3 stories, trilogy. 5 down, a description that emphasizes a similarity between 2 items, analogy. A group of individuals organized for a particular purpose, also the name of a military unit. This is 3 across. That's a brigade, okay? So you can see, we just do our crossword, we get analogy, we get brigade, and you can go through it on your own. And in fact, go ahead and try it. Go through it on your own and try to finish out all the words. Okay? So this is just a little, if you will, pre-test to what we want to look at. Okay. Now what I want you to do is it's a word game. And what we're going to do is we're going to look on the left here, and you're going to try to tell me what the word is. Okay? So if we look at this, starting with A, ending with Y, first word that comes to your mind, it's probably analogy, right? But that actually doesn't fit, does it? It's allergy, right? What about the next one? It starts with the B, ends with an E. Does it sound like brigade? Doesn't fit, does it? It's actually baggage. If you go through, you'll find that each one of the words in the crossword puzzle is close to the correct answer, but is not the exact answer. All of these are blockers. They're words that have come before and that are fresh in our mind and that actually block us from seeing the correct solution. There's no reason analogy should come to our mind in this top one if we hadn't seen it on the previous slide. All right? So this is a great example of how blockers in the way of pre-bias, how the tasks we do before a certain task tend to prep our mind. That can be both beneficial, but we also have to realize that it can actually block the way we think. So these are caused by implicit memories of incorrect responses. It's often tied to recency, and these blocks are involuntary. I think this is the most important. These are things that you wouldn't know about. You may have figured out that I showed you a crossword puzzle with all the answers, so the task wasn't to do the crossword puzzle. But in real life, you won't know what it is that's blocking you. But you should be aware that what you've done prior to some task oftentimes seeds your mind in a wrong way. And so how do we overcome them? Well, before we talked about this incubation period of just taking a break, right? And the idea is to forget these blockers. Or you can engage yourself in a very intense activity that's totally separate. And that'll tend to get your mind focused on other unrelated problems so that when you come back to this, you don't have that blocker in memory. All right, now I want to talk about fixation. Now the difference between fixation is before we had blockers that were from the unconscious. We didn't know they were there. Fixation is we start to look at a solution and we just can't give it up. Just can't give it up. And once again, the idea is that we fixate on one response and that's not the correct one. And the target one is different. So we're going to do a little word game here real quick just to show you an example. All right, so this is another one of these word tests. I'm going to put 3 words together. I want you to think of the one word that combines them. Okay? Salad, head, goose. Okay? See if you can think of a response. What connects them? Lettuce, right? Lettuce goes in a salad. You have a head of lettuce and you have goose. No, right? Doesn't work. All right, now try to think of a word. I bet lettuce doesn't get out of your mind, does it, right? Particularly because it almost fits. And I think this happens a lot. When we have an answer that almost works, it's so hard to let go of. So what is the solution? Egg. Okay, we'll just do one more here. Bed, duster, weight. And now I'm going to mesh with your minds and tell you room. Bedroom, weight room. Doesn't fit with duster, does it? What word goes with all 3? Can you let go of the word room? It's really hard, isn't it? Particularly when it's almost there. The answer is feather. And I'll just give you some extras if you want to try them on your own with your friends. And the paper these all come from are at the bottom. So these are all examples of where a simple blocker word gets us fixated and we just can't get away from it. And so these are misleading hints or information that actually impede your ability to come up with the correct solution. So incubation, once again, helps this. Fixation is created by our environment and also our active tasks. So usually fixation isn't a problem unless we're really trying to work on something and we've come up with a blocker. And once again, how can you overcome these? We've talked about this by taking a break or by focusing on something else. All right, I want to now talk about expert versus novice. Because once again, education has taught us that you want to learn as much as you can, practice as much as you can to become an expert. Because novices can't solve problems. But we all hear those great stories of how some novice solved a problem that the expert couldn't. So let's talk a little bit about this, this play or dichotomy between being an expert and being a novice. Oops. Come back here. All All right, so this is some data from the Beatles. So in 1963, the Beatles had 4 major #1 hits, all of a sudden. If you were sitting at home and you were a teenager, you wouldn't hear anything about the Beatles in 1961 or 62. 1963 would seem like, bam, there they are. This amazing group came out of nowhere. And so for a lot of people, it seems like they just got in, saw a new style, picked it up, and they were brilliant. Now, they were obviously brilliant, but if you go back and look at the history, they actually started working together back in 1957. And if you look at the data here on the slide, between 1957 and 1962, 90% of the songs that they played were somebody else's. So it wasn't that the Beatles weren't around and they weren't playing. They were just playing somebody else's music. And it wasn't until 1962, 1963 did they start to write and produce their own music. And there's an interesting chart here of the proportion of Lennon-McCartney songs per year. So when they first started the band, about 25%, which that makes sense. You start a band, you start playing some of your own. And that quickly died away. So in 1958 through 1961, about 5% or less were their own songs, and they were playing other people's songs. But still, this is 4 or 5 years of practice. In 1962, suddenly it rose to 17%. And in 1963, their breakout year, 67% of the songs they performed were their own. And by 1964, 100% of the songs were theirs. So a lot of us have read Malcolm Gladwell's book that's talked about the Beatles and the 10,000 Hours. All this research was actually done well before Malcolm Gladwell's book. This was actually done by Robert Weisberg at Temple University. But we can see before this breakout, there was thousands of hours. Weisberg calls it the 2,000-hour rule. They played in public for 2,000 hours before they had the breakout. Gladwell's description talked about their practice and their performance, where he got 10,000 hours. But what we can see is that these guys didn't come out of nowhere. They actually been playing and working really, really hard for a long time. And this is actually something that is very characteristic of most of the most creative people that we know. That oftentimes it really is an expert that's practice and practice and practice and practice and practice and become a virtuoso at what they do that have really succeeded in being creative. This is some data by John Hayes, who was at Carnegie Mellon. And Hayes, once again before Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 Hours, had a 10-year rule. And this is actually a plot of Mozart's work. The bottom axis is the number of years in his career, and the y-axis here is the number of recordings, or number of works per year. And what you notice is he steadily increases to about 10 years, and this is where the bulk of his career is. And when they went back and looked at the recordings, and what they did is they said, look, if they recorded a piece of music, it must be good. And so they went back at Mozart and said, okay, what songs have people been recording, or what do we value and we think is most creative? And predominantly, they all come from this area after the 10 years. During this period, just like the Beatles, he was growing, he was learning, but he hadn't quite reached his master capability yet. And so one thing that Hayes was interested in was trying to figure out, was this an age thing? Did Mozart start early and that's why it was 10 years? And so what he did is he actually took many different composers. I think there was 14 composers. And he grouped them into 3 ages. One was between 3 and 5, one was between 6 and 9, and one was 10 or later. And this is when they started. So they started really young, started sort of young, and, well, I still think 10 is pretty young. And what they found is that if you normalize the number of works composed per year really takes off at 10 years from the start, okay? So no matter when they start, it's roughly about 10 years. And in fact, the older you were, it took a little bit longer. So what the data showed is this 10 years really isn't about what age you are, but really how long you've been in this. And so for many, many of the most creative people we know, it's come after a prolonged period of developing an expertise. So most new creations require an ability to perform at a state of the art. So we talk about creative acts, we talk about something that's new and of incredible value. And it's very challenging to create something that's new without having the best skill set that's out there. Requires skill and training to become a master. We talked about the 10 years rule. Creative individuals are invariably some of the hardest working people you have ever seen. But that does not mean that hard work leads to creativity. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about spontaneity versus planning, because I sort of think about creative people as sort of, we've talked about the ideas just coming to them. So I think about them kind of being free and just, getting all the information, not somebody that's very methodical. Because methodical to me sounds like I'm following a process. It sounds like it's canned. It doesn't sound like I'm really, being innovative in any way. And so there was an interesting experiment done on planning. And this was by two authors back in the 70s. And what they did is ask a series of art students to select objects in a room and then compose them and then draw them. And what they did is they looked at a few criteria. So before drawing, they looked at the individuals and they wanted to figure out a couple questions. How many objects were manipulated? Were these objects unusual in any way? And how carefully did they examine it? Did they just pick it up, or did they really look at it in depth? And then while they were drawing, they examined how much time it took, and did they change through iterations as they were going through? And finally, was the final product just a copy of what they'd done, or had they somehow transformed what they were drawing as they went through the process? And here's the data. They had some art critics come in and judge, not knowing what the experiment was. They just judged the final pieces. And these asterisks here, so 2 asterisks means there's a 1 in 100 chance that it was a random event. 3 asterisks is 1 in 1,000. 1 asterisk is 1 in 20. So pretty much if you see an asterisk, it's an indication that there's a strong correlation here. It's not something by chance. And what they found was that all of the planning ahead of time, the number of objects, the unusualness of the objects, and the careful examination had a very strong correlation with how creative it was perceived. And in fact, they went back and looked 7 years later at the same people, and they saw that that pre-planning was also very important. What they noticed was the most creative acts came from people that actually spent the longest time thinking about it. If you've ever looked at works by Picasso, one of the amazing things, one of the reasons why he's often cited for creativity, is that he left us with his final work, but then he left us with almost a complete library of his pre-work. And every person in one of his cubist drawings or paintings, he would do 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times. Paint them, just that person, before he'd assemble the final picture. So this idea that planning is not part of the creative process is something that was a little bit, I thought might have been true, but the data says no. It says the most creative people spend a lot of time thinking about it, working at it. All right, now I want to go to something that I think maybe a little bit of a heresy in the creativity world, that divergent thinking leads to creativity, okay? And so what do we mean by divergent thinking? There's really 2 types of thinkings that we talk about. One is idea production, and the second one is idea application or evaluation. So some of the authors that have been cited in the literature for many years has been De Bono. I think it did 6 hats of creativity. Adams had block busting, and Gordon did synectics, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the idea was divergent thinking was all about finding ways to develop more ideas. A greater pool of ideas would lead to better ideas. Okay? And Gilliford also talked about divergent versus convergent thinking. And it's in the same lines as we talked before. 2 examples are divergent is list as many white edible things you can in 3 minutes. Just list. Think about a few. All right? And the other one is list all the uses that you can think of as a brick. So here you're trying to apply something very specific. So that's kind of the divergent versus convergent thinking. So what I want to talk about is something that we've all heard about. So 1950, Osborne proposed something called brainstorming. So how many here have done brainstorming at some point? Probably all of us. And really, it was looking at the judicial versus the creative mind. And that somehow by judging, we kill creativity. And I think that can be true, but just as a general notion, it seems kind of a broad stroke on the idea of critical thinking. And so the idea behind brainstorming, just to go over it again, is that criticism is ruled out, so there's no judging. Freewheeling is welcome. So you're asked to generate as many ideas as you can, just kind of vamp, think about ideas, say what comes to your mind. What we want is the largest number of ideas. And if you think of an idea that combines something of somebody else's, you can feed off one another, that's great. So the question is, does it work? Is this really a good idea? And so I want to share with you a research example by Dennett and other authors that I think is pretty interesting because it really went at this idea of does brainstorming as we know it work. And so they had a couple different people they tested. So the first were actual groups. They took 4 people, put them together, and had them work on some brainstorming tasks. They had then what they called a nominal group. Now a nominal group is I take 4 people, put them in different rooms, but I collect all their answers as if they were in a group. And what they found is that nominal groups, putting 4 people in different rooms, created 30 to 40 more ideas than if those 4 people were in the same room. The quantity of ideas was greater when people were alone. We'll talk a little bit about why that is in a second. And Dennett suggested that maybe people were being inhibited by the group. All right, so that speaks to this idea that brainstorming together generates more ideas, and that data suggested that it did not. Deferring judgment, meaning not being critical, and being critical. And how does that really affect us? Deferring criticism, is that really giving you a benefit? And so what they did is they did an exercise at Purdue for finding a brand name for cigarettes. And what they did is they put together groups and they had them brainstorm. And what they found was that brainstorming produced more ideas than if somebody was alone. Now I just want to clarify. They didn't build nominal groups. They didn't take large groups of individuals and put them together. They just said if I sat alone in a room and generated 10 ideas and you put me in a group with 4 other people, we'd all generate more ideas. So you did get more ideas, but not more good ideas. And we'll talk about that in a second. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the idea we have of delaying criticism, and is that important? So there was an interesting experiment done at Purdue, and they put together a couple teams of doing different types of brainstorming. So they did regular brainstorming, where they put 4 people together, generate ideas, and then after that, they try to select the best. Then they did another experiment where they actually said, generate the criteria for the ideas, and then go generate a bunch of ideas. And then they had a third group where they just said, pick an idea, judge it, pick an idea, judge it, pick an idea, judge it. Okay? What they found is the brainstorming group, the one that just went freewheeling before there's any criticism, did indeed create more ideas. But not necessarily more good ideas. The critical logical group, meaning the ones that had criticism before or actually went in a serial process, they did have fewer ideas, but as a percentage had a larger number of good ideas. And so here's actually the data. So in standard brainstorming, the total ideas per group were 15. Reversed means start with the criteria, then freewheel. They also had 15 ideas. And the criteria group was come up with the criteria, pick an idea, measure it, go to the next one. So obviously at 9.8, they had quite a bit fewer ideas. But if you look at good ideas, it turns out that brainstorming did have a slightly larger number of good ideas, but not significantly. It's not like this is an order of magnitude greater. And then if you look at the percentage of good ideas, actually the critical group had the largest percentage. And so does this say brainstorming is bad? I don't think so, but what it does say is that withholding criticism isn't necessarily a prerequisite to generating creative ideas. I think what's more interesting is the fact that in the previous study, that the nominal groups generated more ideas. That's to me what was the most interesting. And what the studies have shown is that groups actually tend to homogenize individual ideas and contributions. So if we're in a group and we're generating ideas, we tend to come up with ideas that agree with the other ideas. It's very atypical for a group to get together and it be the emotional feeling of the room that my job is to come up with something totally different than you. Groups maximize agreement. So people have found that actually in brainstorming, you don't generate the best ideas in a group, but the ideas that come out have the best agreement and support by everyone. Creativity often comes from the individual. These nominal groups generated more ideas. And when you put people together, this homogenization that happens tends to quash the creativity that's there. So this sounds counter, right? Because every time you go into a company, you go into class, we're going to get everybody together, we're going to brainstorm, it's going to be great. Well, before I've been talking generally about people, and typically what we do is we get 5 engineers together in a room. We get 5 English majors in a room together. We get 5 microbiologists in a room together. The exception for where groups really give a big impact is when the group brings significantly different perspectives and expertise, meaning each member of the group is very different than the other. A colleague of mine, Rick Harriman, he runs Synectics, which is a creativity training company. They actually do a lot of, not brainstorming, it's really analogous thinking, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But he actually bought a race crew pit boss into a fast food restaurant to give a perspective on getting things done really fast and efficiently. That's the kind of disparate expertise that really drives value in creative environments. And this expands the idea pool because everybody's looking at things different. So eclectic groups help, similar groups hurt. So you need to think about the next time you're going to do brainstorming, is the people you're pulling together just like you? If they are, you may actually be hindering your ability to create. All right, so I want to talk now about this idea of analogous versus divergent thinking. Okay? So analogous thinking seeks to find similarities between the current state and other states. And I just want to note a little distinction that the psychologists point out that I actually think is interesting. Association is connecting things in a known way. Bi-association is connecting things in a new way. And I think we think of creativity more as being this bi-association, this taking 2 disparate ideas and finding a connection that we didn't see before. And analogous thinking is actually trying to get us to make known, and if we can, unknown connections. So analogies develop more ideas that are relevant to the topic at hand. So I'm not a big believer in divergent thinking, but I am in analogous thinking. I think working on generating a great deal of analogies generates a lot of good and relevant ideas, as opposed to just generating a lot of ideas. And so there's 2 analogy methods, 2 principal ones that have been very popular. The first one, as I mentioned, is called Synectics. This wasn't invented, but William Gordon wrote a book back in 1961, and basically he was working with teams on creative brainstorming. And he would actually examine groups of 8 to 10 people doing brainstorming or trying to come up with a creative idea and try to analyze what was going on. And he proposed ways to elicit analogies as 4 of them: personal, direct, symbolic, and fantasy. And these are sort of, if you will, metrics or methods for you to try to develop an analogy. So I just want to give you an example here. So for personal, let's say we're trying to work on timepieces. It's like a watch. So you could think of yourself sitting inside of a watch. What would it be like to be in a watch? What would it like to be looking outside? What would you be sitting on? Would you be sitting on some gears, or would you be sitting on a little quartz crystal? We can think of a direct analogy. A watch is a timekeeper. Are there other things that keep time? Symbolic. We could think of things that are periodic and rhythmic, right? That have the same kind of essence of keeping a rhythm or a pattern going. And finally, for fantasy, why don't we think about how space aliens on another planet would tell time? It's kind of ridiculous, but it seeds your mind with a new way to make connections and analogies. And in a couple of weeks, we're actually going to go through some synectics training. So I'll leave that to Rick, who is going to train with us. All right, the second one is an attribute analogy system that was proposed in the 1970s, and it goes like this. So let's assume the problem is to improve a fireplace. So what you do is you list its attributes. So its name is a fireplace, its form, geometric, angular, conical, function, heats a room, color, black, brick red, etc. What material is it made of? So these are its attributes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at making analogy trains. So start with the name and try to make some analogies. So it's a fireplace, so an analogy could be a combustion chamber, teapot, an auto engine, cigarette lighter. The form, so it's physical form. Crystals, prisms, function. Cat on a lap, right? The function is to heat. A cat on your lap warms your lap. So basically this is another way to try to seed a method for you to find analogies. And so here's some examples of some ideas produced. You could change the name to energy transformer. You could try forms which are derived from crystal structures, and you could use a robe insulation principle to conserve radiant heat. So this is a way that you generate analogies and try to put them back into work. So what's interesting is John Hayes, who's done a lot of work in complex problem solving in psychology, pointed out that psychologists have not found clinical evidence that these analogous methods actually work. So in brainstorming, they've actually shown that, so-so. But they haven't shown that this is better. But what's interesting is industry all over the place believes these work. And I think it's because, in my personal opinion, that industrial applications, the group and the process and the outcome is highly valued. And so it's a little bit distanced from a clinical setting. And I think industry probably, even if it works so-so, if it leads to an idea, in industry, the process is valuable. So just a little bit interesting. I haven't seen any updated work on this, but I'd be interested if anybody finds any papers on analogous thinking and current thoughts by psychologists. All right, here's a favorite one of mine. Thinking outside the box doesn't work. All right, so here's a Necker cube, and if you haven't seen this, take a look at it, and you can ask yourself, is this back corner, is it in the back of the box, or is it in the front of the box? And just stare at it, and you'll see it switch from one to the other. All right? And so this is an example of an aha moment, where you basically reform the problem in your brain, and you suddenly see something new. So here is a very, very well-known problem. It's called the 9-dot problem. And the problem is using 4 lines connect all the dots, but your pencil cannot leave the paper at any time. Okay? So we've got these 9 dots, and I'll just give you a second. Why don't you go and try it? All right. So some of you got it, some of you didn't, but let's take a little bit of a look here. For those of you that didn't get it, I'm going to give you a hint. The lines need to extend beyond the box. The box is created by these 9 dots. So the lines that are going to connect them have to go beyond the actual box that outlines those. All right, go ahead and try to see if that helps you solve it. All right, let us look at the solution. Ta-da! So if you will, I can start, let me just make sure I get this correctly. Yeah, I start here, I can go down, up, down, and back, and I get all 9, right? So the key to solving this problem is what? Is going outside of the box. Now there isn't a documented citation, but it's believed by many that this is actually where the term outside the box came from. But what's interesting here is I told many of you to go outside the box. And in fact, they've done this in research studies. Telling people to go outside the box does no good. It helps a little bit, but people don't know what that means. Just knowing that I have to go outside the box doesn't really help people figure out what the solution is. And so they did some experiments where they tried to figure out what would help them solve the problem. I want to mention here, This is another solution that I saw in Brain Games with National Geographic. If you think about these dots as being big, I can actually draw 3 lines that go through all 3. So I thought that was pretty clever. I'd never seen it before. So this was a research paper where they actually tried to do some training. And if you notice, we've got a 9-dot problem on the left, and then we've got a couple sequence of dots. And what they would do is they would give each sequence to people and ask them to try to do the same exact problem, 4 lines, don't leave the paper, with these. And what you notice is if you look at this, it immediately seems that I need to make a line that goes long out here, right? Immediately. And so what they found is that after people tried these, they were much better, much easier to find a solution as these practice problems. You can read these later on in the slides, but they also gave people a strategy. They told them, here's a strategy to solve the problem. So when I told you just to go outside the box, it wasn't very helpful. This is actually giving a metric and a process to figure out how to solve the 9-dot problem. And here are the results. So the control group, 9% of the people solved the problem. When they just gave them practice, 22%. Interesting, strategy, 34%. So if you just had to do one thing, giving somebody a strategy to solve the problem was the biggest. And strategy plus practice, 60% of the people solved. So just saying going out of the box actually doesn't help you at all. What people needed was a strategy and practice. And so that's why trying to find a creative solution, unless it's from an incubation period where you unconsciously piece together ideas, it really comes from practicing and working and doing exercises and developing a strategy. And that is how you can increase your ability. Just thinking outside the box doesn't really do you any good. All right, I want to talk a little bit about here towards the end about motivation and creativity. And this is some work by Teresa Amabile across the river at the business school. And she's written several books. The couple slides I have here don't do her justice. But I want you to think for a minute about, have you ever seen somebody doing SUDUKU? Probably we all have. Somebody sitting on a train, sitting on a plane. Ask yourself, was there any purpose to that? Were they trying to get to some goal? They're just playing it to have fun, right? Now I want you to think about something else. This is actually an analogy that Amabile used. In a maze, if I was your boss and I came to you and said, look, I'm going to give you $100 for every maze you can draw a line through, you would figure out the most efficient way to get through the maze, right? To get your $100. You would not stop and doodle in the maze to see, are there other ways to do it? If your professor gives you a problem, or you're out in industry and your boss gives you a problem, the way it's set up with extrinsic motivation, meaning pay, promotion, if you're geared towards that, you're always focused on finding the lowest risk and the most efficient solution to get there. You're not likely at all to play around and explore other solutions. You're not likely to play SUDUKU. And what Amabile found was that she asked questions like, what would you do if no one paid you to do it? What do you do when you're not at work? Do you have an avocation and a vocation? And her point is that you really should pursue problems that align with your motivation, because you'll have the most energy and effort and the likelihood of success. And also, it's only in things that we're intrinsically motivated in that we're going to spend that extra time to play, that we're going to spend the extra time to doodle through a maze and try to figure out another way of solving something. This was a quote that Donald Trump had: "Money was never a big motivation for me, except as a way to keep score. The real excitement is in playing the game." And I think this kind of says it. For him, running businesses, turning over businesses, for him is a game he likes playing. The money is just the way you keep score. Now, if you've ever seen or know Donald Trump, it wouldn't seem like to him it's that way. It would seem like all he cares about is the money. And so Amabile's model basically puts together 3 legs to the stool. So she cites expertise as being critical for creativity, as we talked before. She talks about creativity skills. So we've talked about this analogous thinking as one example. And then really the pillar that she puts on that others didn't pay as much attention to was motivation, and she really focuses on intrinsic motivation. Because it's only when it's coming from within are you really going to spend the time to explore these other options. Because think about it. If your boss comes to you, you're not going to play around. You're going to get it done as quick and efficiently as possible. All right. So that's it for our 10 myths on creativity. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and feel free to email me if you have any questions.